Hey, hello. June is over. Summer came in at the end there with a vengeance, and I somehow read 11 books over the course of the month, so I would love for us to be able to talk about them. 11 felt like kind of a return to form, but I'm hesitant to get too optimistic about it because I feel like my reading life recently, especially this year, has been a real roller coaster of doing really well and feeling like I'm back in a kind of groove that feels more familiar one month, and then the next month I will face plant slightly and not get through as much, but I am here to be grateful and excited for what I do read and get through when I do. And like I said, this month we got through 11, and ideally I would have slipped in some more at the end there, but I didn't want to rush through them right in the 11th hour. So I've started off July strong already. I was also helped a little bit by the fact that I was going through one of my phases where I could concentrate on audiobooks, because I sometimes go back and forth. I'm either like very focused and can bust through a bunch of audiobooks, or I go through phases where I could not or cannot focus on an audiobook to save my life, and that's just the way it goes. As always, we have talked about a few of these books already, but before we dive all the way in, hi, my name is Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel, and if that sounds of interest to you, go ahead and like and subscribe, and I would love for you to hang out more. Starting the month off strong, I read my book club book, which I also did a dedicated reading vlog on, so you can go there to get a little bit more of my reactions in real time. But this is The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett, which is the first in the Anna and Din mystery, fantastical mystery series. I did get the second one checked out from the library, which multiple people have now corroborated that they enjoyed even more than this one, but it does have holds on it after me, and I don't know what my reading speed and or trajectory is like in July, so I might have to get back on the hold list for that. But I really enjoyed this. It follows Din, who is a new assistant in this fantasy world, to Anna, and essentially they're detectives and they are being called in to investigate a murder that has a little bit of an elemental aspect to it, and there is of course political intrigue involved. It is a little bit or a lot of it Sherlock and Watson-esque, especially with Anna. But what I really enjoyed about this book in particular is that we were seeing things through Din's first person point of view, and so that really impacted how we as readers were encountering things in the world. One, it threw us in a way that trusted us as readers, even if it did take a little bit of trust in the world building and just kind of floundering for a bit, but floundering in a way that was already comfortable because we were already in the midst of a mystery. But again, I liked Din's point of view because as a reader, we could tell that he was holding back information from us and that he was keeping secrets. And that also kept things interesting in terms of the revelations of what was happening. And because this was a completely new world we were being thrown into, or at least that I was being thrown into, and this was my reaction, I assume because of that, I actually found the mystery and the solving of the mystery the least interesting thing about this book. And that's not to say that it wasn't interesting. I just preferred the world building, the character building in particular. There was a lot of really good sarcastic banter back and forth, especially between Anna and Din, as Din is kind of the one that checks her. There was just a sprinkled dash of romance, and in fact the mystery seemed more primed to help me understand the kind of political landscape of this world, or to introduce me as a reader to the given circumstances of this world in terms of us setting up a longer series through the revelations of this mystery. Also, if you watched my reading vlog, I was very invested in not being wrong, not because I can't admit when I'm wrong, but because I just don't like being wrong, especially in mysteries like this, and I am very capable of overthinking things. So there were a couple of moments where something happened and I was like, I'm gonna regret this, aren't I? Or this is setting up this other revelation, isn't it? And it didn't necessarily do that. So in that aspect, I was wrong, but it kept me on my toes. And part of that keeping me on my toes was, again, that information that Din was holding back. And I don't know that he was necessarily a full-fledged unreliable narrator, but we had to constantly kind of keep in check what we may or may not know, or that he may be keeping back vital information, and that was going to impact our perspective of what was going on and our reading of this mystery. Additionally, the political commentary in here was really stellar, I thought, and I did have a revelation about like halfway through the book that this is a post-pandemic book, and that directly impacts the mystery and is a much more immediate commentary. But overall, I'm very excited to dive into the next one, especially as I have been told by trusted sources that it expands the world even further and makes sense of a lot of the mysteries, particularly involving the Leviathans that are set up in the first book, because it leaves enough questions open. I think the structure of it and setting it up as the first book in a series was really expertly done, because we had just enough catharsis and answers to feel satisfied at the end of the book, but there are still enough open-ended questions or things that we don't know that it feels like we have set up the larger world. So hopefully, fingers crossed, I will be able to get to book 2 yet this year, because I anticipate it, if nothing else, being on a lot of end-of-year lists. And then for my first audiobook of the month, I listened to You Didn't Hear This From Me, Mostly True Notes on Gossip by Kelsey McKinney. This is just a nonfiction exploration on the nature of gossip and how gossip is perceived culturally, especially in relation to it being considered a much more gendered pastime isn't the right word, but how it is reduced in some ways because of its association with women, and how it's not always malicious, and that there is a lot of morality assigned to gossip when oftentimes that's not always the full extent of it. Kelsey McKinney is the host of the Normal Gossip podcast, which I don't listen to. However, full disclosure, I have been known to enjoy some normal gossip. I love some like low stakes, in the sense that nothing is inherently criminal workplace gossip about a workplace that is not my own. I also really enjoyed the explorations of gossip in the book in terms of religion, particularly in relation to prayer concerns, which I don't think it dove deeply enough into, to be completely honest, because there is this tendency, especially within Christianity as I was raised in it, to talk about gossip as a very negative thing, and yet churches are inherently very gossipy places, whether that is acknowledged or not. And I don't know that this fully dove into all of that, and this may just be my own stuff in my history that I need to unpack, but it specifically talked about a memory that the author had around unpacking a kind of traumatic event that the news of broke while they were at a youth group lock-in, which I recall very viscerally, but how she was asking for more information to try and make sense of what was going on, and the youth leader kind of shut that down as gossip and encouraged them all to pray about it instead. And this idea of how a lot of exploration is shot down. And I think it goes even further than that. And that was kind of a very innocuous anecdote in the grand scheme of things. But also, if we think about things like the prayer list, regardless of intent, or maybe because of intent, it is inherently gossip at the same time. It's just about how it's being framed. And a lot of this book is exploring this idea of how it is being framed, and especially because of the idea of gossip's connection to women, it is seen as frivolous or malicious in whatever way, when oftentimes what is perceived as gossip is a way to spread information in a community and to protect a community. And I want to be clear, this is not a wholesale defense of gossip, because I think there is still a lot of malicious gossip. However, I always think it's interesting to unpack these ideas and explore them deeper, and I think that this attacks the question from a lot of different perspectives. There were, of course, opportunities to go deeper still, but I thought it was just a really interesting thought exercise, and it also kind of lived in that nonfiction realm that I really enjoy, that is kind of cultural criticism And so I really enjoyed it. Next, I read The Listeners by Maggie Stiefvater, which is her adult debut. And I have a Feature Friday on, and I mentioned this in the Feature Friday as well, but going into it, because I did read an advanced reader copy from NetGalley, I had forgotten that this was historical fiction, which I love, but particularly World War II era historical fiction. And this takes a look at a very specific piece of the historical puzzle within World War II that I frankly was not aware of, in which, as the US was preparing to enter the war, a bunch of Axis diplomats or anyone they perceived as potentially connected to the Axis powers were housed in luxury hotels. And this is following most particularly June, who is the head of the Avalon Hotel, after she is told that this is going to happen. And so there's a lot to unpack there, and I think in this particular historical moment, especially even things that have transpired since I read this book, especially with certain institutions being built in Florida and the lack of hospitality, especially luxury hospitality there. And it was frankly uncomfortable for me to be reading about Axis powers being offered this luxury when contrasted, though never spoken, because of the historical perspective of the book, it just wasn't a known yet how people viewed as enemies to the Axis powers were treated. But this was also, as Stiefvater explained or explored on the Barnes & Noble podcast, because I listened to her conversation about this book prior to sitting down to film my review to try and unpack it a little bit, because I recognized that there was this real emotional reaction I was having and a real kind of disquiet I had around the setup of it, even as Stiefvater's language is as lush and gorgeous as ever here. But she talks specifically about how she was interested in this book in kind of layering metaphor. And there is, as I have become used to in Stiefvater's young adult fiction, there is this element of the kind of odd. In this case, it is the sweet water that exists in this place. And so there is a lot to unpack and a lot metaphorically available to the idea of water that I think is explored at different points in the book, whether it be washing away, whether it be rebirth, whether it be cleansing, whatever it may be. There are many interpretations, obviously, that we all talked about in high school English at some point, but the metaphor doesn't stop there. In fact, I found myself at the beginning of the book wondering if the Avalon itself was a metaphor for the American dream and the luxury of the American dream, and when we strip it back, what is the truth of that? And I think that that's a valid interpretation as well, whether it was the truth of it or not, because as Stiefvater said, she was interested in kind of building layers of metaphor. However, I do wonder if the novel kind of drowned in metaphor a little bit, because we were primarily following June, who was the head of the Avalon, as well as Tucker, one of the FBI agents brought in to kind of oversee things and to essentially spy on these diplomats. But we follow them as characters and we follow their relationship as it changes and their kind of positioning in the world and their relationships to each other and how that kind of changes their outlook on the world as well. However, it feels sometimes like some of their character revelations or reversals, those big moments in their character arcs, don't feel as rooted in action, or it feels like they happen, especially with Tucker. There's a revelation that he has later in the book, something that he reveals to June, where as a reader, it wasn't really evident to me what pushed him to that moment of revelation. And I feel like it was something that had been teased so much throughout the book or built up in such a way that it was a big moment of revelation for him. It was a moment of him choosing to trust her, and what was ultimately the moment that kind of flipped that switch for him as a character. And so I do feel like for something that was so thematically and character driven, I do feel like sometimes our characters meandered a little bit, but at the same time, it was a very nuanced, poetic exploration of both the characters and the place, and it was meant to invoke an emotional response, which I think it absolutely succeeded in. Okay, next I listened to Nobody in Particular by Sophie Gonzalez, which is billed on the blurb as The Prince of Me meets Young Royals. I absolutely adore The Prince and Me. I have not yet seen Young Royals, but I explained it to someone as Gossip Girl meets Her Royal Highness by Rachel Hawkins, and we are following two point of views. Danny, a new scholarship student in a fictional nation, and Rosemary, who is the princess of said fictional nation. And Rosemary and her best friend have had a falling out of sorts prior to the start of the book because there was a tragic accident involving a friend who ended up passing away due to some teenage recklessness. And Rosemary's best friend does not feel like Rosemary has been emotionally attached to this. She feels like Rosemary is only upset about the loss of their friend in relation to how it has potentially impacted her public image. And so Danny is walking into this and makes friends with both of them. However, over the course of the book, more than friendship develops between Danny and Rose, and so they are trying to navigate this relationship in the midst of Rose being closeted as a young royal and what she feels is expected of her coming of age and to inherit the crown, and the weight of responsibility attached to that in relation to what she can accomplish as a ruler versus as an individual, and that being some of the motivation for the importance she places on that. And Danny just being a little bit more reserved and nervous to be seen to whatever breadth, and doesn't want to rock the boat of the friendships that she has formed in this new place, as well as she didn't have the best time at her last school. And in the midst of all of this, they're also kind of dodging rumors that are being planted in the press, and the idea of if there is a leak essentially in their friend group. I really had fun with this one. I too did worry at times that we weren't really dealing with the emotional weight of the loss of life of this friend, and Rose's in particular recklessness in that situation, or any of these teenagers' recklessness in that situation, which I guess speaks to my age more than anything. But we did really swing back to deal with the emotion of that, and how Rose was or is the kind of person that really bottles that all in, and how she works through that grief by taking control of what she feels like she can control in her life. And so I just really enjoyed both points of view in this one and both of our heroines, and I thought it was a fabulous audiobook. And then I read A Duke Never Tells by Suzanne Enoch, which is a closed-door, importance of being earnest-esque romp of a historical romance. We are following 4 points of view most directly, with some extras thrown in for good measure, and 2 direct romances. And we start the book with Meg and her Aunt Clara kind of talking about Meg's future as she is looking forward to making her debut, only for her plans to be thwarted by her parents telling her that she has been engaged to James, who is not yet the Duke, until promptly after receiving this news, James's father dies, and Meg is not only not making her debut that season, but she is thrust immediately into mourning for a man she's never met. Fast forward to a year later, where she is just coming out of mourning, and she has still not met her fiancé. However, she has heard some stories about him around town, and so she gets it in her head with her Aunt Clara, who is closer to her in age than she is to Meg's mother. So they're almost kind of like sisters in some way. And they get it in their head that they are going to go to James's country estate and try and get some information from the servants. And so they are going to pretend that Clara is a visiting lady and that Meg is her companion, and they're just going to kind of tour the estate and see who they can kind of needle with questions. What they do not anticipate is that prior to their arrival, very closely, James has in fact taken up residence again at this country estate. And as they are preparing to show up, he is having words with his father's man of business, Renikin, who is trying to get James to make some decisions about the estate that has fallen into disrepair because of his inattention. And not just over the past year, but even prior to that, as his father had really stepped back and tried to force James's hand into acting the part of the Duke, essentially, by wanting him to make decisions for this estate. And so Renikin is exacerbated, but instead of actually taking any responsibility, because James is a man-child in the Sabrina Carpenter sense, especially at the beginning of this book. I mean, jury's out on the end. You can make your own determinations. He goes to the wine cellar instead, and after being properly sodded, he ends up opening the door to Clara and Meg, where he introduces himself not as the Duke, but as the butler, because he thinks that these ladies are going to be visiting for just an afternoon and he doesn't want anything to do with them. So this forces Reniken to play the part of James, the Duke. Except then Meg falls down the stairs of this estate because it's in disrepair, forcing them to stay on longer. So as you can tell, hijinks and mistaken identities abound, and it is very farcical in nature. And because of this, while I was having a good time, I do think that the shtick went on just a hair too long for me personally at around just over 350 pages, because even though we were switching between a myriad of points of view, we weren't building the same amount of emotional depth at the same time. It was well executed for the form that it was, and so if you're going in looking for more of a historical romance rom-com, this is definitely going to fit the bill, and I could see it working very well on stage or screen in particular. But especially with James, while he felt like a hero very much in the Oscar Wilde vein, which is clearly what he was modeled on, I found myself wanting to push him down the stairs myself for a good portion of the book. And while he did have those moments of kind of coming into his responsibility, I don't know that it went far enough for me. Additionally, because we were playing in the realm of mistaken identity, a lot of the stakes felt tied to the potential accidental reveal of that identity, even if people were not putting pieces together in any sort of expedited fashion. But also because of that, it felt like we couldn't, or the characters couldn't get to know each other at their essence as much, or you could argue they were getting to know each other at their essence without the kind of baggage of their station in life or their class. And there were moments of delightful emotional depth, particularly with James and Reniken, and kind of exploring James's resentments and how he thought his father preferred his master of business and would have rather had him as a son, and also Reniken feeling like he had all of this emotional attachment and care and love for this man, but was not really a part of the family. I think that exploration was really lovely. I also did enjoy the kind of comedic asides from additional point of view characters, especially the exacerbated valet, who was really upset about how he was being asked to dress the Duke over the course of the novel. And I also love the moments where James was like throwing verbal insults at him that just went right over his head, as well as the explorations of class that were at play here. So if you're looking for a more rom-com, farcical exploration of the upstairs-downstairs dynamic in your wait for Bridgerton season 4, this may fit the bill. And then right before all of the conversation regarding AI in the book community popped off again, I read Immaculate Conception by Ling Huang, which, if you have been following that conversation or are interested in that conversation, is a book I think you should read. And while with her debut novel, Natural Beauty, Ling Huang kind of explores body horror and the horrors of the physical, here we are exploring the horrors of the mind with artists Inka and Mathilde, as well as the nature of art, artistic inspiration, the privilege of access to art and artistic communities and conversations that help instill that artistic voice and vision, as well as what is considered art, as well as following a codependent and frankly toxic friendship between our point of view character Inka and Mathilde, as well as Inka's artistic jealousy that really serves as a guide for her through the narrative, even if she is lying to herself and us as readers about that motivation. And Inka's point of view in this is really interesting, especially in relation to the art in question and Mathilde as an artist, because sometimes when Inka was explaining or describing the art that she was so in awe of and so jealous of instinctually, I was like, okay, but the narrative is set up in a way where we're not supposed to question the genius. At the same time, there are these moments that peek through where it reveals that not everyone really does fawn over her all the time. There is a reference to a date she goes on with a guy where he makes an offhanded comment about Mathilde as an artist, and because of that, Inka cuts him off completely. But like with Natural Beauty, this is twisty and psychological and compelling in its voice and point of view. And while it isn't completely linear narrative structure, we do kind of start with a moment of crisis later in Inca's life and kind of flash back, it is still linear enough. There are moments where I wonder if it's kind of playing with fragmentation and kind of expressionism within the structure, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that that's really how it is structured. It's just something that's very interesting to me in relation to Huang's setups, where she gives us so far these really artistic protagonists where it could be utilized or seep in to the narrative structure, but at the same time she's inventive enough already. Would that be just a step too far? I don't know. I don't know that this is a technically perfect novel, though I want to be clear, it doesn't need to be. It is still incredibly compelling and exciting in its vision and voice, even if there are moments where I do think it drags just a little bit or loses sight of itself just a little bit. But again, I think that the vision is so distinct that I can overlook that. And then I listened to Little Bosses Everywhere, How the Pyramid Scheme Shaped America by Bridget Reed, which is the latest in my line of anti-MLM novels, books, nonfiction that I am so interested in. And I wasn't sure that this book was going to only talk about MLMs in its framing specifically of the pyramid scheme in that subtitle there, but it does really only focus on MLMs. There is some overlap to, if you've read books like Jane Marie's Selling the Dream, in relation to the history of MLMs, that I do feel is important for a new audience if they're coming in, or you're coming into this book as your first introduction to the concept of multi-level marketing, or even your first introduction to the critique of multi-level marketing. I feel like that history is very important, especially as Reed is setting this up and exploring this really through a journalistic lens, and so setting that precedent. Where I find that this deviates, it has those moments of reflection on the kind of reckoning of MLMs post-2020 that I do think is one of the strengths of Jane Marie's book versus her podcast as well, where usually I would recommend, and honestly probably still would recommend, The Dream as your kind of introduction to anti-MLM or multi-level marketing critique, but there is something to be said about that real drastic shift 2020 and after, and watching everything play out in real time, I think gives me a different perspective on that, but I think it's important to have in this narrative. What I really, really appreciated about this book, and where I think it stands out so far within this subgenre of nonfiction, is that it really draws the political lines. I know it's more common now to have references to things like the fact that Betsy DeVos from the first Trump administration is directly tied to the founding family of multi-level marketing giant Amway. But this goes a step further, and while directly acknowledging that there is lobbying on both sides, this draws a direct line from multi-level marketing to things like Project 2025 and very real political outcomes of things like this, as well as how the multi-level marketing think has seeped in to especially Republican spaces in relation to the rhetoric that is being forwarded and how we talk about shaping policy. I think it could have gone even further, but I think it was a really successful primer to these ideas, and honestly I was just excited to see these ideas laid out baldly for the first time in this way. And then I have a Feature Friday on it, so I don't know how in-depth I'm going to talk about it, but I read my favorite book of the month, Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab. This is a kind of thematic continuation, or I guess in conception, prequel to Addie LaRue in terms of loneliness, but it's an angrier exploration of that loneliness through the vehicle of toxic lesbian vampires. Here we are following three women across time and exploring their desires and wants and hungers, and how the historical moments they are in respond to those desires, as well as having properly labeled vampires and protagonists that are allowed to be messy and explore the kind of corruption of some of these desires and our hungers, which is explored thematically in the idea of vampires corrupting over time, or the idea of them dying slowly in some ways, or dying to their humanity, but also that being a thematic stand-in. This is a character-driven novel that really focuses on the characters, and it meanders, but in a very focused way. And so I think that that helped me personally feel like we weren't getting lost in that wandering, as well as I just really enjoy V.E. Schwab's voice as always. And so within the V.E. Schwab canon, this is definitely most directly aligned with Addie LaRue. So if you enjoyed Addie LaRue, I definitely would check this out. Or if you wanted Addie LaRue to have a little bit more bite, a little bit more anger, definitely check this one out. And then I finally read The Perks of Loving a Wallflower by Erica Ridley, which is the second in the Wild Winchester historical romance series. And I read The Duke Heist years ago. I think it came out in 2021, and Tommy and Philippa were set up in that book, and I've had their book on my Kobo for years and finally got around to reading it. And so we are following Tommy, who is the Winchester of this book, who is a master of disguise in a lot of ways, and she goes undercover for a lot of the missions. And one of these undercover missions involves pretending to be elderly Aunt Winchester and accompanying her sister, who is now a duchess, to a reading circle that Philippa leads, which is where Tommy develops a big ol' crush on Philippa, which leads to her siblings essentially betting her that she can't talk to Philippa, and leads to Tommy pretending to be the Baron in order to talk to Philippa. And while she eventually reveals her real identity as Tommy, there is some benefit to the Baron in relation to him potentially courting Philippa, and the way that Philippa's life has really been constrained by her parents, who are determined to get her married this season and determined to see her married well this season, to the point where they are limiting her access to her friends through her reading circle and her other blue stocking pursuits. And yet despite this, she is still very acutely attuned to her blue stocking pursuits, in the sense that one of her friends in her reading circle had the code that she created stolen by her uncle, who is being awarded by the government for this code, and Philippa is trying to find proof to give to basically unmask this man as a fraud and kind of give her friend her credit back. And so Tommy is roped in to these escapades as well, and is beneficial as a Winchester and brings the other Winchesters on board in trying to solve this case for Philippa, while her alter ego or disguise as the Baron is occasionally helpful to Philippa in relation to her parents, who don't approve of her marrying the Baron by any means, but do approve of him as a means of showing Philippa's desirability and bringing in other suitors. And while this all sounds very serious, or maybe it doesn't, maybe it sounds perfectly primed for hijinks, and it's a little bit of both. There is a wonderful kind of comedic tone throughout this, especially in relation to the siblings, who are a delight and Philippa finds a delight, as well as the real tension between these two. And I really enjoyed the kind of reversals and reveals, especially toward the third act of this, and the kind of emotional climax, and what Philippa felt a solution to things was that maybe mirrored what a reader might anticipate a solution being, especially with Tommy putting on this facade over the course of the book. But what would it mean to put on that facade for a lifetime? And so I think it explores some real truth of identity in that, and balances the humor and the heart really expertly. And then I listened to YA romantic comedy And They Were Roommates by Paige Powers, which I think is going to be right up your alley if you liked the Fence novelizations especially. This follows Charlie as he is transferring in as a scholarship student at the Valentine Academy for Boys, and he has specifically requested a single room because he is hiding his identity as the school's only trans student. However, there has been a mix-up at some point, and he finds himself not only with a roommate, but his roommate is Jasper, an ostentatious poet who happened to break his heart a couple of summers before at summer camp. But Jasper doesn't know that, and so Charlie is bound and determined to get out of this room and focus solely on his studies, as he has to maintain himself in the top 5 of the student body in order to retain his scholarship, a really highly competitive student body. And he finds himself kind of floundering in that even from the beginning, as the academic competition is really fierce. And so in this, he finds himself as a scholarship student getting kind of dragged into a tutoring program to offer tutoring services. Except this tutoring program also happens to be the front for a letter writing scheme in which the top 5 boys of the Valentine Academy will kind of direct and sometimes write love letters for the sister academy, because the top 5 students of each respective school have access to the stables and are able to kind of pass these letters back and forth, letters that are important in the lead up to the big co-ed dance. And so Charlie essentially ends up agreeing to help with this endeavor in exchange for Jasper going to his aunt, who is the principal, and getting a different room, and Charlie getting his single. But of course, over the course of things, hijinks ensue and feelings become a lot more complicated. This was a really kind of, oh, this was a little farcical as well, but it really kind of leaned into the over-the-top nature of things, which is why I would compare it most directly to the Fence novelizations, which also were kind of over the top in a lot of ways, but I already had an emotional connection to those characters from the comics, where there's a little bit more suspension of disbelief in terms of the kind of characterization. And here there is depth, especially with Charlie. Jasper was harder for me because he felt a little too over the top. He didn't really feel grounded for much of the novel, and so I had a harder time buying into the romance there. There was additionally a side character that existed purely for comedic effect and would just like shout things about animals and whatnot that I really disliked because it was just too much for me. But at the same time, I think that if you're in the mood for something light and fluffy and has that element of escapism to it while also still grappling with the very real dangers in many ways that Charlie is facing, I think that there is a nice balance there. At the end of the day, I don't know that the emotions rang true enough for me to really buy into it fully, but at the same time, it is still a fun and frothy YA contemporary. And then finally, I read The Night and the Moth by Rachel Gillig, which I won't dwell too much on because I do have a feature Friday on it. But here we are following Seer Sybil. Listen, I don't question it, I just go with it. But Sybil is the most devout of her group of seers who are on the verge of aging out of their obligation to the church when the recently appointed boy king comes to essentially have his fortune read. And Sybil, or as she is known at the time, Six, is the one to read his fortune, which is full of bad omens. And this also puts her in contact with heretical knight Rory, who does not seem to have the proper respect for gods and omens. However, she is forced inevitably to ask for his help later when her sister seers start to disappear one by one, which puts her on course to face off against the gods of her world and have to question everything she knows. I really liked the gothic tone and imagery of this. I really enjoyed its exploration of essentially religious deconstruction. I felt like I was tricked a little bit in that way, but in a good way. I really, really loved a gargoyle that was a character in this. He provided just enough comedic relief and a lot of the emotional heart of the book, I would argue. The romantic element and the romanticy of it all was definitely a factor in this book, and definitely a factor in the hype of this book. And I do, unfortunately for me, feel that the romance fell a little flat, and I have seen some mutuals echo this sentiment, so I at least know that I'm not alone in it. And I don't think it was completely unsuccessful, but I do think that it was underdeveloped. I liked that it attempted a slow burn. However, the attraction was instantaneous, which is fine. We can notice someone's physical attractiveness instantaneously. However, it didn't feel to me like we really explored enough of the emotional depth in wake of that to help build that slow burn in a way that was fueled by anything more than that initial physical attraction. We were also limited because we were in Sybil's point of view, and so we didn't get as much of Rory's backstory in a way where it allowed for that emotional vulnerability between the two. We did get his backstory told to Sybil from the Boy King, and she lets him know that she has heard this story, and there is an opportunity there to kind of build on that for Rory to explore the kind of betrayal of that story being told without him or for him, which is touched on but doesn't go fully. And so I think that the thematic explorations and Sybil's deconstruction kind of take precedence over the romance, even as the romance is still vital to a lot of what decisions she's making, and Rory and her connection to Rory still play in to her worldview and those decisions. And so I would have liked to see that amped up just a little bit. And I think that there were moments, even amidst this really beautiful writing and the kind of invoking of these beautiful mental images, where the narrative did kind of sometimes stray into telling us rather than showing us. And I think that there was a narrative kind of precedent set as a kind of fix-it to some of this, in the sense that we start being told a story. And so in many ways, we can look at a lot of that as kind of storytelling conventions, or us being told a story. But there are those moments where it feels like we are just being given exposition. I was especially thrown out of the narrative at the beginning of chapter 3, where it says, "My name is Sybil Delling, by the way." I think the "by the way" was the cherry on top there. And yet, in spite of this, I still did really enjoy my time. I loved the kind of medieval imagery of this, even as I feel like we are getting a lot of novels this year that are really leaning into medieval imagery, and a lot of novels that are really exploring kind of religious deconstruction, especially religions that are coded or kind of reminiscent of Christianity in some ways. So that's very interesting. But I do think that this establishes a really interesting world and characters, and I'm very excited or intrigued to see where we are going to go next after where book 1 leaves us. And so that was June. Not too shabby. If you have read any of these books, I would love to hear your thoughts below, and or I would also love to hear how your June reading went. So thank you for hanging out and hearing about mine. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah,